Why did Patrushev cross the Atlantic? The conflict between Russia and the West is not reduced to the northern Black Sea region, which is the most important and crucial for us. The confrontation is taking place on virtually all areas of the world chessboard. But it would be a great oversimplification to think that it is limited to the fact that the US and the West as a whole are pressuring countries in the global South to comply with sanctions, and Russia is fending off these attacks by protecting its relations with independent states. For all the importance of this part of the confrontation, there is also a strategic one, and it consists of Russia building structures and mechanisms of global interaction with the non-Western world, i.e. an alternative to the Atlantic Global Project. In the first instance, this applies to Germany, RICS and SCO, which more and more countries are seeking to join, and is linked to the joint work of Moscow and Beijing. This is a crucial but long process, because most countries in the global South, although realizing that the era of Western dominance is coming to an end, want to ensure that their transition to the new world order is as painless as possible. That is, they are betting on Beijing and Moscow, but they are not going to drastically damage relations with the West, which means they have to adjust to the same Western sanctions against Russia one way or another. But there are also many countries in the world that can afford not to look back at Washington because their relationship with America has already been broken for a long time. And, as a rule, at the initiative of the United States itself, which has declared these countries to be enemies of America, the axis of evil and other devils of hell. And it's not just North Korea or Iran, but a whole group of Latin American states, that is, countries located in a region where America considered everything that was going on to be its personal business, even before it became a superpower and world hegemon. That is why the visit to Latin America of Secretary of the Security Council Nikolai Patrushev is so revealing. Putin's closest associate regularly visits the region, not to mention Cuba, discussed later, where he has been and now. But the current trip is different from the others. Yes, Patrushev met again with Raul Castro. The real leader of Cuba. It will be 93 this year, and he's been in power since 1959 and visited the Republic of Nicaragua, whose current leader, Daniel Ortega, first came to power in the early 1980s. These two countries are on a have experienced American pressure and interference. But besides negotiating with their leadership, Patrushev had another goal in mind. A five-party security consultation meeting was held in Managua with representatives from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Venezuela has a long history of building diverse and close ties with Russia and being confrontational with the US. Bolivia, with all its internal cataclysms, is also trying to follow its path. Both Patrushev and Putin have long-standing and strong relationships with the leadership of all four countries. But this is the first time Russia is bringing them together. The multilateral consultations are not just a salute to Washington, but an indication that Moscow is moving to build a sustainable security system in the region. Anti-American? Yes. All of these countries need protection from US pressure, and Patrushev promised worldwide comprehensive support for our Latin American friends. And these words are addressed not only to the four countries participating in the Managua meeting. It is important that Patrushev came at the head of a large delegation, which included representatives of 10 agencies, from security to economic. That is, Moscow's attention to Latin America is becoming strategic, and the development of policy in this direction will not depend on changes in the geopolitical situation. There will be no repetition of what once happened in our relations with Cuba, when in the 90s the collapse of the Soviet Union led not only to the collapse of bilateral ties, but also to the deepest economic crisis on the island. Because Russia is not on a declining but an upward trend in its history, unlike the United States, whose influence on both Latin America and the rest of the world will steadily decline. But not by itself, but under the influence of both objective processes in the world and Russia's specific actions and steps. Now let's move on to Cuba. It appears to be becoming Moscow's big ear again, as Western intelligence agencies claim that Russia is secretly returning radio intelligence systems to Cuba. The photo shows a radio electronic intelligence center in the Havana suburb of Lourdes during the Year of Conservation in 2002. The U.S. intelligence community says there are signs of revitalized military cooperation between Moscow and Havana. This month of March proved to be rich in events not only in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, but also in other far more distant tranquil parts of the world. Anti-corruption government speeches in Cuba have been quite rare since the beginning of the socialist era on the island of Liberty and even earlier. And here they surprisingly coincided with a large package of agreements between Moscow and Havana, which gave good hope that the domestic problems of Cubans will be reduced and investments from Russia will flow into the country. For more than 60 years, expressing exceptionally friendly emotions towards our state. The entry of the Mir system, hundreds of Russian companies of various profiles, exploration and mining, which lost many of the world's, and resorts by Russian tour operators. All this had the a priori support of the BRICS, and from this it was even more fundamental. Members of the organization can now do things through Russia that they can't say directly, so as not to quarrel with the US. But most alarming to U.S. intelligence officials are the increasing cases of direct military Russian-Cuban cooperation. By the way, here are Cubans in the volunteer ranks of the Russian army. It all began with the creation of structures to attract Cuban contractors to the Russian army. The Cubans know how to fight. During the Soviet era, their contingents helped us a lot in Africa and had high morale. So guys like that definitely wouldn't hurt. This information was later confirmed, and we do have volunteers from Liberty Island. Russian specialists were then increasingly seen in the process of rebuilding the island's air force and other military infrastructure. And in recent days, Western publications have thrown a real tantrum over this. Photo. Here, according to Centers, is the latest mobile radio interception system based on the new Uralnex truck. Many Americans who lived through the Cold War era still remember the story of the Soviet Electronic Intelligence Center in the Havana suburb of Lourdes. In 1985, this location was designated by the U.S. National Security Council as the primary listening base for classified telephony, military communications, dual-use satellites, commercial vessels, and NASA services at Cape Ditch Space Base. In 2002, our country had to mothball this facility. The Americans called him Moscow's Big Ear. And on the basis of this, rumors of a Russian return to Lourdes arose about every 5 years. But every time they turned out to be rumors. Now, based on the sudden appearance of the Cubans' state-of-the-art radio interception systems, it is suspected that such activity is underway. At least it would seem logical. And here's a photo of Cuban soldiers in Angola in the 1980s. The Cuban contingents were distinguished from most Soviet allies by their well-trained and motivated fighters. In general, it appears that the Americans have gone anti-crisis on this occasion and turned on their meager ability to influence the social situation in Cuba. The country's current problems are certainly influential as well, but the CIA's activities here are not to be doubted. Understandably, ordinary, everyday people are outraged by the domestic problems with electricity and food. But it's a matter of how you look at it, isn't it? Compared to the rest of the region, Cuba does not look like an island of poverty and hardship. The mess in the democratic in quotes from the U.S. point of view Cuban neighbors is much bigger, and it keeps slipping into global chaos. In principle, a very favorable form of existence from the point of view of U.S. interests. And if we compare it by the coefficient of human development index, i.e. the level of medicine, access to education, family support, state support, and a number of other social criteria, Cuba is at a cosmic level compared to Haiti, where criminal organizations simply rule the streets. And if you think it's paranoia to suspect the Central Intelligence Agency of involvement in Cuban affairs, that's a huge mistake. Cuba is for the CIA a place of dashed hopes, and for today's expansionist US a latent threat that could turn existential at any moment. Let me remind you that this is where the Cuban Missile Crisis began, the point at which humanity was closest to World War III.